The initial successes of the Soviet winter offensives led to lofty ambitions in the Stavka, while the drama inside the German high command continued. Believing in a sweeping victory, Soviet forces are thrown into a meat grinder in an attempt to destroy the German invaders almost entirely. This week we will cover the events of December 21st to December 27th, 1941, as Hitler is forced to choose either Kluge or Guderian. The massive losses and subsequent large-scale raising of replacement formations throughout 1941 had placed a heavy strain on the Soviet officer corps. Requirements for receiving a commission had been reduced to only 6 years of general education and no criminal record. The vast majority of junior officers had no military education or professional skills. Making matters worse was their high casualties, resulting in many being killed or wounded before they managed to learn on the job. Personal autonomy was also heavily discouraged. This helps explain many of the failings previously mentioned in the Soviet officer corps. This is also why Soviet propaganda would focus on its most senior figures, such as Zhukov, who would rapidly become the byword for unqualified success in the USSR's public consciousness, regardless of reality. The mass recruitment had also placed strains on Soviet logistics. Not only was heavy equipment in relatively short supply, but shortages in winter gear and field kitchens also started to appear, which further limited the effectiveness of Soviet troops in the winter. This week, Stalin would send several caustic messages to the newly formed Volkov front for not winning as rapidly and dramatically as he required. The Stavka had expected the Volkov front to have seized its jumping-off points and completed its force concentrations for the next stage of the offensive by the 26th. Driven on by this, the 4th and 52nd Armies would push to the river line between Kurishi and Novgorod and start to expand bridgeheads across the river by the 27th. However, Ivanov's 4th Army failed to secure its objective at Tigoda Station. Furthermore, the 54th Army continued to attack Kurishi and its environs all week to no avail. During this time, Leb reinforced this strongpoint with the 291st and 269th Divisions from Leningrad to transform the town into the centerpiece of the Volkov defensive line. In addition to German resistance, weather had hindered Soviet troop movements. Partially accepting the reality of the situation, the next stage of the offensive was delayed until early January and would be launched in a staggered sequence. On Christmas Day, Leb would try to twist the events into a German victory in an address to his troops. However, like many German claims of success since the start of the invasion, the listing of casualty figures belies the truth that the Tikhvin offensive failed. It had been desired to encircle the 54th Army, link up with the Finnish at the Svir River, and cut off supplies to Leningrad. Glantz estimates that the Soviets lost 190,000 troops in the Tikhvin offensive, the counterattack, and the associated attacks around Leningrad, out of the 300,000 troops deployed since October. Meanwhile, the Germans had deployed 180,000 soldiers in the same area at the cost of 45,000 casualties. Across the front line, many German officers would try to convince their men that their invasion of the USSR was a holy one to reinvigorate the soldiers. The Soviets, however, used Christmas as a chance to attack German morale. One example was a Christmas card of a snowy landscape dominated by crosses with German helmets hanging on them. It was simply captioned, "Living Space in the East." Halder would host 2 massive Christmas parties on the 24th. He and his closest associates would be among the few men in the Wehrmacht to have a good Christmas, as the Soviets launched massive attacks across the front line. Both the USSR and Germany took every chance to disrupt any significant day on the other's calendar. While Halder partied in luxury at Mauerwald, the Osther celebrated on empty stomachs or fought for their lives. Despite the optimism in his speech, Leb doubted his army's ability to resist a renewed major attack due to the lack of reinforcements. The frozen swamps had extended his front line, which he lacked the troops to cover. The withdrawn 8th and 12th Panzer Divisions were forced to provide 3 battalions each for rear area security. Only the 20th Motorized Division remained as a reserve force. Leb feared a Soviet assault would hit the boundary between the 16th and 18th Armies. This shortage of manpower forced the 225th Division to be airlifted from Liepaja port to speed up its redeployment. As December closed, the ice-covered Lake Ladoga had thickened again to 1 meter, enough to support supply trucks and even KV tanks. This, alongside the various organization reforms, led to an increase in supply flow to 700 tons on the 22nd and then 800 tons by the 23rd. This was significant because it was the first time the Road of Life met the daily consumption rate in Leningrad, allowing rations to increase for the first time since September. Workers and engineers would receive 350 grams of bread, while employees, dependents and children would receive only 200 grams. However, famine and disease still ravaged the civilian population, as other food needs could not be met. In an attempt to alleviate suffering, the Leningrad front released 300 tons of food from its stockpiles. Soldiers also voluntarily reduced their rations to help save the starving population. Even with these measures, 50,000 would die in December. Even more work was needed to increase the throughput over the Road of Life. Traditionally, Hitler's halt order on the 18th is held up as saving Army Group Center. This view was especially promoted by Nazi propaganda and the initial histories. The order certainly provided strategic clarity when no one had been willing to take responsibility. Furthermore, fighting in place was almost certainly preferable to the seeming alternative of a long retreat. The short retreats had already been ruinous for the divisions involved due to the amount of equipment abandoned and sheer exhaustion of the troops from marching and exposure to the cold. However, the halt orders were too restrictive, preventing or severely delaying movement when needed. Even company-level commanders technically needed Hitler's permission to move troops. However, permission from Hitler would take hours or days to receive after extensive arguments and any crisis mounting to a breaking point. While the Nazis believed the will trumped everything and had successfully indoctrinated the majority of the officer corps, the Wehrmacht had been developed around the idea of Auftragstaktik. Subordinates were allowed to take the initiative to achieve the mission, rather than strictly follow orders from above. In this tradition, many officers decided their mission was to keep their formations alive, rather than hold ground, and acted without communication due to claimed time restraints. An illicit form of elastic defense formed, as many formations would withdraw without permission to prevent needless losses. These positions were then restored with timely counterattacks. The 1 to a million scale maps at Hitler's HQ would not change, and thus he would not know. Some recent studies have found that this disobedience was widespread throughout Army Group Center, but most of the officers involved were junior enough to keep the events hidden from Hitler. Furthermore, often divisional or even corps-level commanders would covertly assist these efforts. There would be many diary entries of retreats which were never authorized by High Command. For example, the War Diary of the 46th Panzer Corps recorded the 5th Panzer abandoning the villages of Luzlova and Kuzminskoye. These were then recaptured in a counterattack that afternoon with heavy enemy losses. This autonomy would alleviate the worst implications of Hitler's orders. Last week, the Soviets successfully pushed the Germans back from Moscow. Now they ambitiously aimed to encircle and destroy Army Group Center. Zhukov, at a minimum, wanted to push the Germans back to their pre-Typhoon positions. Zhukov's second stage began on the 18th, though in some areas their attacks were delayed. By the 22nd, attacks were slamming into every section of the German line, probing for weakness. Strauss's 9th Army continued its slow retreat towards Staritsa, carefully maintaining the cohesion of the front line. However, Staritsa was just a geographical point on the map, with no terrain features favourable for the defenders. Strauss flew to Kluge to request permission to continue his retreat to Rzhev, where the Volga offered some protection. However, the 9th Army appeared to be the most secure sector of the army group, and Hitler had already decreed it was a waste of equipment to fall back to the Königsberg line. Kluge was not prepared to expend time and effort pleading his case for the army in the best condition. Thus, Strauss would be stuck defending Staritsa. Stalin had reinforced the Kalinin front, while the 9th Army lacked any mobile reserve. Casualties rapidly mounted as the 9th Army fell back. Even Halder began to fear the army was crumbling by the 25th due to its losses. Buoyed by the inaccurate reports of foreign armies east, Strauss was left to hope that the Kalinin front would run out of manpower before he did. However, Konev was under strict orders to attack, and thus ignored the plight of his army. Attack after attack was fed into the meat grinder. The extreme cold had forced the fighting to rage only over villages and houses providing shelter. The areas in between were only lightly held by reconnaissance troops. By the 26th, the 6th Army Corps had exhausted its reserves and desperately requested permission to withdraw. Strauss refused, citing Hitler's order. Kluge endorsed this decision, but added a caveat to the order. On the 27th, both the 6th and the 23rd requested immediate withdrawal, which was granted for the evening of the 28th. To the east, Reinhardt was focused entirely on his own command, paying no attention to the wider front line. He had already ignored orders from Hoepner to cover a broader section of the line. Hoepner would also accuse Reinhardt of falsifying reports of neighbouring units' retreats to justify his own unauthorized retreats. On the 21st, Reinhardt refused orders to send the 2nd Panzer to assist the 5th Corps at Voloklensk. Only after arguing with Hoepner would he reluctantly acquiesce to sending a single panzer battalion from the 6th Panzer. Both panzer groups were part of the 4th Army. However, Kubler had not yet arrived from Ukraine to replace Kluge as the commander of the 4th Army, forcing Kluge to deal with yet more drama from the panzer commanders. Kluge returned both panzer groups to the Army Group's command and would assist Reinhardt as temporary commander of the 4th Army, and Panzer Group 3 was combined with the 5th Army Corps. Reinhardt, however, would manage to delay his departure long enough to torpedo his plan. Stümmer of the 40th Panzer Corps became temporary commander of the 4th Army instead. Kubler would finally arrive on the 26th. The Großtransportraum simply lacked the fuel and trucks needed to deliver the required amount of munitions for intensive defensive battles. The intensity of the fighting had increased supply-demand, but train deliveries only declined during December. As a result of this, after days of constant fighting, the 5th Army Corps had been forced to surrender Volokholamsk and Ivanskoe by the 24th, due to a lack of ammunition. These withdrawals were not authorized, but Ruoff didn't receive any rebuke. Again, Reinhardt had refused to assist Ruoff despite orders from Hoepner and could only be pressured into eventually sending a single battalion more in reinforcement. On the 26th, a major assault broke the lines of the 106th Infantry Division, which had been reduced to 300 combat-effective men. Only 10 tanks from the 6th Panzer Division were sent as reinforcement, but only on the condition they were returned. On the 28th, the 5th Corps managed to rally and counterattack, retaking the heights west of Ivanovskoe and encircling some Soviet formations. Ruoff had been greatly aided by the secure flanks and the close proximity of mobile divisions. They had suffered multiple small breakthroughs during the week, but these had been easily counterattacked and crushed by the mobile divisions. The 4th Army had been the only formation not to carry out a major retreat by the time of the renewed Soviet offensive, leaving them as a bulge in the front line when Hitler's halt order was issued. Its front was well established along the Nara River, with layers of bunkers and trenches. However, Guderian's negligence had created a crisis to its south, where the Soviets had split apart the 43rd Army and 24th Army Corps. Guderian had repeatedly refused to act, despite both corps being under his command, forcing the 43rd Corps to be transferred to the 4th Army. Despite Hitler explicitly denying permission, Kluge granted Heinrici limited autonomy to maneuver his corps away from the Soviets. Kluge wasn't inclined to hold the front line blindly, but allowed various small retreats where needed while trying not to endanger neighbouring formations. While we know only of the event with the 43rd Corps, it is possible Kluge issued more covert orders to withdraw, but with no records left behind. The withdrawal of the 43rd Corps came just in time, as a new attack on the 22nd broke through to the north, leaving it exposed on both flanks, in danger of being encircled and cut off from the rest of the 4th Army. This also left the 13th Corps with an exposed southern flank, and the whole of the 4th Army at risk of being rolled up from the south. Kluge begged to be allowed a substantial withdrawal, but Holder remained deaf to his pleas. Hitler, however, would eventually be worn down, and allowed Kluge freedom to withdraw if needed. Thus, the 13th Corps would withdraw to the north, while the 43rd fell back on Kaluga. Kluge also eased the 19th Panzer Division out of line and reinforced it. They were then sent south to counterattack the Soviet breakthrough, although it would not arrive until the 28th. This, however, weakened the 57th Panzer Corps, which then had its front line broken on the 27th. The 98th Infantry Division started to break down under Soviet attack, although it just about managed a fighting retreat. hoped to present a fait accompli of his retreat, which was not tolerated. Surprisingly, Hitler would devote several hours trying to convince Guderian despite his insubordination. By the end of the day, Hitler believed he had managed to secure Guderian's obedience, if not agreement. Meanwhile, Schmidt was having to deal with a Soviet breakthrough. Kluge ordered the 48th Panzer Corps to withdraw behind the river and to abandon Livny, freeing up forces to counterattack this breakthrough. Hitler refused. The 9th Panzer Division would manage to counterattack in a series of actions between the 20th and 22nd. Their success temporarily stabilized the situation and restored German lines. By this point, Guderian had returned to his headquarters and issued Hitler's order to the complaints of his officers. The Second Army was not to surrender any more ground, despite Schmidt's protests. On the 22nd, a Soviet offensive broke the lines of the 296th Division. When permission to withdraw was denied, Guderian retreated anyway. The next day, he ordered his entire army group to retreat to the Oka River, ignoring Kluge's counter-orders. On the 24th, Kluge contacted elements of Guderian's forces and quickly established that they were still retreating and that Guderian had repeatedly lied about their positions. While this would have been the chance for Kluge to be rid of Guderian, he reported the retreats were under the compulsion of circumstances, which was actually somewhat true. Having just covered for Guderian, Kluge expected some loyalty in return. Guderian was asked to close the gap between Bielew and Kaluga and strengthen his left flank. Guderian's response was extremely hostile, and ended with him requesting that he be removed from command, or having a military tribunal be brought against him. On the 25th, the two would come to blows again, as Kluge found out about the 47th Panzer Corps' unauthorized withdrawal from Chen. In response, Kluge presented Hulda with an ultimatum: either he or I must go. Guderian requested to be relieved of command again. This was done by Hitler the same day. Schmidt now commanded the small army group. Schmidt, however, continued in the exact same manner and constantly withdrew without permission from Kluge until his group reached the Oka River. There they fortified themselves and sought to repair their worn-down equipment. With the Second Army being pushed back so far, Army Group South would transfer the majority of the 168th and some of the 62nd Divisions to the Second Army to help shore up its boundary with the 6th Army. Soviet attacks began hitting the northern wing of the 1st Panzer Army on the 25th. Soviet attacks were also launched towards Kursk and Kharkiv. None of these attacks seemed to have much success. Both Germany and the USSR were too focused on other sectors of the front to make major operations in this area. At Sevastopol, the assault of the 22nd Division was halted by the arrival of the 79th Naval Brigade, which had force-marched north upon its arrival. This bought time for the 8th Naval Infantry Brigade and 95th Rifle Division to withdraw from the Mamashchi salient to the Belbek Valley on the 22nd. The well-trained and equipped 345th Division would also arrive later in the week. These reinforcements and the incessant shelling from the battleship Parishkaya Kommuna and its naval group blunted the other German attacks. The only noticeable Axis success was to the south, where the 170th Infantry Division, alongside the Romanian 1st Mountain Brigade, was able to finally capture and hold on to Chapel Hill after several days of a seesaw battle. This had been the key location for the Soviet defensive sector too, but the Germans were unable to exploit their success. Hansen would order the attacking forces reorganized on the 23rd to make a renewed attack at the end of the week. Manstein, however, demanded an all-out attack on the 25th, believing the Soviet defenders were about to crack. This attack failed when, instead of the expected weak point held by tired defenders, the main effort ran into fresh soldiers from the 345th Rifle Division. Manstein halted these attacks the same day, but demanded a more focused offensive against the Mikencievi mountain positions. By this time, the Soviets had received over 26,000 reinforcements, while the German divisions had received none. Early in the morning on the 26th, the 51st Army returned to Crimea. 5,000 men landed in the first wave of the amphibious landing around Kerch. Tolbukin wanted to demonstrate his ability and devised an overly complicated plan for the naval landing. This meant the initial naval landing was actually a series of small landings north and south of Kerch. It depended heavily on the VVS and Black Sea Fleet providing fire support for these small groups to keep them alive. Storms meant 2 of the landings were cancelled. Furthermore, a lack of landing craft meant whaleboats were used to transport men and equipment to shore, leading to many soldiers drowning in rough waves or developing hypothermia. This left 5 disjointed beachheads with frozen, lightly equipped and tired men who could not communicate with each other. The plan assumed they would connect up. Instead, they just dug in to wait for a German counterattack. Furthermore, one landing had been opposed and nearly instantly contained by a small German force. All this left Manstein believing the 46th Infantry Division could deal with the Soviet attack alone. Then Reichenau decided that the 46th and 2 supporting Romanian brigades were insufficient to resist any major Soviet offensive, so he sent a single regiment from the 73rd Infantry Division to support the defences. Furthermore, he ordered the port facilities of Kerch destroyed if the defenders were forced to withdraw. And on the 22nd of December, the Arcadia Conference starts, with the USA eventually agreeing to a Germany first policy. Next week we will continue, as Hitler takes the trains away from the army. To receive future updates, ensure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to view them. Unfortunately, even if you are a member or a patron, you still have to click the bell button, otherwise YouTube will just not send you notifications. Thank you very much for your kind support. It is because of you that we are able to produce so many videos and do our dream job. Don't forget to participate in the weekly polls to vote for the next exclusive video. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.